It's great to be back. I love Bournemouth, and James and I were just discussing how every time I come to Bournemouth, the sun seems to shine. So when James first booked me in to speak in February, I thought, oh, I love going down to the seaside, but I do prefer it in the sunny weather. Wouldn't it be nice if I could go in the summer instead? But hey, summer in February, which I'm delighted about, but also terrified about because it's not quite right, is it? Okay, so just to build briefly on what James was talking about there. So this is a book that I've just finished writing. Anyone who follows me on social media will know that this was quite a big job getting this book written, and I might have moaned about it a little bit, but now that it's finished, in a few months' time the book will come out and I'll feel proud and delighted by what I've done, and I'll forget about the pain of the writing. The book is about mental health in schools, and it's basically about how we can take a whole school, sort of whole organisation approach, and it's very, very practical, simple, and the idea that we were kind of briefly discussing was whether, you know, it would be worth bringing people together to sort of approach this as a bit of a network and think if this was, you know, some practical ideas we could sort of work through together. But be more than happy to discuss that with any of you if you were interested to. But today we're here to think about how we can support students with eating disorders. I have tried to make the content of my talk as practical as possible, but also bearing in mind that obviously there's quite a range of different sorts of people in the room. So when your students might be of very different ages and at very different stages in their academic career. So I've tried to make this as widely applicable as possible. I'm more than happy to take questions, or if anything I say doesn't make sense or you want it clarified, please do put a hand up. Otherwise, I'm happy to take questions at the end. Before I do anything else, for those of you who haven't met me before, I always feel the need to explain my name. This is because otherwise I get to the end and I ask for any questions, and I have many years of experience of people asking, why are you called Pooky? And it makes me really doubt myself professionally and think, did you listen to anything I said in the last hour? So instead, I tackle this elephant, or rather small rabbit, in the room from the off. So this is Pooky. Pooky is a magical miniature flying rabbit from a series of books from the 1950s. And yes, my mum did also spell it wrong. And that's all I have to say about that. You know, we all have our cross to bear, right? Mine is a miniature male flying rabbit. However, people do tend to remember my name, which I guess is a good thing. Though when I go to Starbucks, I tell them I'm called Jane, because when you live with a name called like Pooky, then you get some very interesting takes on your name. And the most common one I get is Porky, which, as someone who is in recovery from anorexia, is kind of ironic and sometimes really distressing. Anyhow. Right, we'll roll on. So I work in the field of mental health. I work very widely, sometimes at a very high strategic political level, working with the government on things like the latest Green Paper, sometimes working with other governments too and thinking about how we can make big change happen. I love that kind of work, but actually the work I most enjoy is the very practical work I do down on the front line with people like yourselves. And this work is all about me trying to take the latest best practice, the clinical evidence base, and trying to translate this into simple stuff that we can all do that works day to day with the students in our care, recognising that our mental health services are hugely overstretched, and there's a huge number of pupils who perhaps we end up supporting beyond what we feel was within our training or that's within our comfort zone. So trying to build confidence and skills there. I also have lived experience. So I mentioned anorexia already. I live with post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm also on the autistic spectrum. So I do rely on you to give me very clear feedback when I'm talking. So if things are going okay, very positive body language is stuff I can pick up on. If it's going less well, booing, jeering, the throwing of soft fruits is the kind of cue that I find easier to pick up on than subtle body language. So what can we do to help our students who have got eating disorders? I'm going to work through, I'm very logical in the way I work through. Those of you who've seen me talk before will know I'm a lover of lists and structure. You can have access to the slides, feel free to use them as you wish. You will find my slides don't contain huge amounts of information because I like to be able to work with kind of what's in the room, but you're welcome to use them as you wish. So I'll work through each of these in turn. Don't feel that you have to remember them all. What I'd really hope that you go away from this morning's talk is a few ideas that you feel you can put into practice, a bit more confidence, and some suggestions about kind of practical steps that you might take. So don't feel you have to take this all as gospel and write it all down. Just listen out for the things that feel like things you could build into your practice. Does that sound okay and fair? Okay, cool. Good, thank you. That was very clear nodding of heads, so it's helpful. Okay, so how can we help? So the first thing that we need to do if we're worried that a student might have an eating disorder, or perhaps we've been made aware that they're receiving support and treatment, the first thing that we can do is actually just to reach out and make ourselves known to that student and let them know that we're here to support. So one of the key things that gets said to me by people is, I'm really worried that I might say or do the wrong thing. I'm really worried that I might make things worse. I'm scared of having this conversation with my student. That's a completely normal and natural thing to think, and it's something that holds us back often from having these conversations. But actually, the worst thing you can do is nothing at all. Okay, so things can feel difficult sometimes during that initial conversation. Sometimes you might feel like perhaps you're not getting it right. Perhaps it does feel awkward. Maybe even your student gets angry or seems somewhat distressed or pushes you away and doesn't engage with the conversation at all. However, on some level, that student now knows that they're not alone in this. They know that there is someone there who cares. They know that there's someone there who's not going to judge them for the difficulties that they're facing. And they know that there's someone there that they could reach out to if they want to. Now, if you do have a negative initial experience, it's really important that you do kind of keep the doors open to that student, but also try and proactively offer that support again in future. Sometimes this plants a seed, and your student might not be ready for that support yet, but even though they know now that perhaps you're someone they could talk to, actually having the confidence to take that step and reach out and ask for that support is really, really hard. But if you were to reach back out again in future, they might feel more able and ready to take that support on board. Does that make sense? So don't be afraid. And if you do end up having a conversation where you find yourself walking out of the room and thinking, wow, that went really badly, because this does happen sometimes. Eating disorders make us think and do really difficult and manipulative and sometimes very unpleasant things. And eating disorders try really hard to protect themselves. So they will warp our thinking and they will make us push away those people who are trying to help us because the illness is kind of trying to protect itself. We can get very blinded by our illness and we can feel like, actually, I can't let you in, you're trying to take this away from me. And on some level, this is meeting some kind of need for me. So we might push you away, we might be angry, we might be sad, we might be difficult with you. So you might walk away from that conversation feeling it went really badly. Actually, it's so important to have that conversation. Don't feel, just because you didn't walk out feeling like you fixed everything, that this wasn't a good conversation to have had. So try and be forgiving of yourselves if these initial conversations don't go really, really well. The other thing just to bear in mind here is it can take time for someone to become ready to take your support on board. So do be prepared to persevere. It's so important, and sometimes it's not the second time, the fifth time, the 10th time that you offer that hand of support that your student feels ready to take it. Sometimes it's the 100th time that you've touched in with them and you've let them know that you're here if they need you. So do persevere. Number 2, in terms of practical things we can do to support our students with their eating disorder, is actually to look beyond the eating disorder. So what we want to do is actually try and remember that this student is a whole person, to try and look beyond anything that's obvious to us in terms of their food and their weight and their shape and perhaps their exercise, all the kind of symptoms that we're seeing of their illness. In order to support someone who's struggling with an eating disorder, it's really helpful actually. I mean, obviously the eating disorder itself needs to be dealt with, but in terms of day-to-day support that we can offer to our students, it's really helpful if we can look beyond that. And that can be really hard. Sometimes those symptoms are kind of throwing themselves in our face. So you might, for example, the most obvious one is when you have a student who is clearly very, very underweight. And it can be really hard to look beyond that, and sometimes everything gets hung up on that. But if we're able to remove that from the equation and actually then look more holistically with the student and ask questions about what's going on, how they're feeling, how we can help practically, rather than always being hung up on the food and the weight and the shape stuff, it can help us to put in place much better support. It's helpful to think about your eating disorder and actually other behaviours as well, things like self-harm too, as a symptom of underlying difficulty and illness. And actually what we don't want to do is just to treat the symptom and just to support with the symptoms, but also to have a look at what's underlying here. So for example, you might have students who are really really struggling academically, and they don't need your help with how to deal with the day-to-day of food. They might be having other input on that, but what they might need is your help with deadlines or how to get the right academic support to help them through. There'll be other parts that you can help with. It doesn't all need to be just about the illness. And sometimes when we are able to kind of have open and honest conversations with students about the bigger picture, and we look beyond the superficial stuff, then it helps them to remember, you know, that they are a whole person. It helps them to realise that we're not judging them, that we don't just see this label when we talk to them, and it can help them to sort of move forwards in terms of their recovery and their support seeking too. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. So try and look beyond it. And this does seem like a funny thing to say, and I would suggest that you do exactly the same when thinking about self-harm as well. Sometimes we can be so hung up on the physical injuries and the manifestation of these difficulties that it's very, very hard for us actually to see beyond that. But actually look at the pupil as a whole, look at the student as a whole, try and look beyond the superficial stuff. Next, we can think about identifying need. So actually, what's really helpful here, people often say to me, I don't know how to help. This isn't my area of expertise. I'm not sure how to help my student. Actually, there is loads that you can do. There's lots that is within your power to do practically day to day to help your student. You might not have the expertise or the time or whatever to help them specifically with the eating disorder, but as I mentioned before, you will be able to support them with lots of other parts of their life, and lots of those might be things that are either triggering eating disorder thoughts, feelings and behaviours, or which are adding to the overall stress. A really, really helpful exercise that you can do with a student is to sit down with them and ask them to think through a typical day from the moment they wake up in the morning to the moment they go to bed at night. And you're having a think in that day about which are the good bits and how can we learn from them? Where are you? Who are you with? What's gone well there? But equally, which are the really difficult bits? When are the moments when you feel overcome with distress or anxiety and you feel the need to kind of engage in those eating disorder behaviours? When we look at a typical day like that, it can help us to identify where there are trigger points, and we can think about what we can do to help with those. So sometimes it's about thinking, okay, you tend to find, you know, that this point in the week or this point in the day is more difficult for you. Are there things that we could do that would help you to feel better as you entered that part of the day, for example? So it might be that you have a student who finds it particularly difficult going into, I don't know, a busy lunch hall, busy lecture theatre, and you might say, okay, well maybe we can learn some breathing strategies together so you can try and get yourself really calm before you enter that environment, for example. So you might be thinking about how to tackle those trigger points. You might be thinking about whether there are some things that can be avoided. If there are particular moments in the day or the week that are constantly triggering this student, then you might say, actually, is there something we can do to manage or avoid that situation? But we also need to recognise there are some things we can't avoid. So we need then to think about how can we manage this in an appropriate way. So that might be about preparing for it. It might be thinking about what the student does to support themselves directly following those situations. But equally, when we're looking through this, we need to talk to them about what's going well, because actually there's loads that we can learn from the moments when the student felt like they were managing, when they did feel in control, when they did feel calm. It's really helpful to think about who they were with, what the environment was, what was going on, and think about what can we learn from this? Can we replicate it at other points? How can we build on that and use it to help us, to help you with the rest of the day? There are some really simple things that we can do when we look at students' kind of typical day and we understand what the trigger points are. And they don't have to be to do with having a really good clinical understanding of eating disorders, and they don't necessarily even have to do with sort of treating the eating disorder symptoms specifically. So we might be doing things like thinking about whether it's helpful for a student to be able to arrive earlier than their peers to a lecture hall or to a classroom, because they might struggle a lot with sort of social anxiety, for example. Sometimes giving the student flexibility to eat different stuff or eat in a different place than their peers can make a big difference. Sometimes it's simple stuff around deadlines. It might be that they are finding that it's very difficult to get their work done on time, or perhaps they've got the perfectionist tendencies that often go alongside eating disorder, and they're finding it hard to get stuff done to a standard that's okay for them. So we might be having a look at either extending deadlines or looking with them about what's realistic to expect here. It's okay to kind of major on your role as someone who is You know, if you're working in the role of kind of teacher or lecturer, it's okay to major on that in your role and think, what can I do to help you in terms of the academic side of things in order to help you with your illness? And sometimes that is about having some flexibility, about extending deadlines. Sometimes it's about helping the student to realise that good enough is good enough. And sometimes it can be really helpful to do really practical things like putting a limit on how long they should spend on a certain piece of work. So what we find sometimes with students who've got eating disordered behaviour is they can go alongside these very perfectionist tendencies or the kind of obsessive type mindset. And we might find that a student might repeatedly redo and redo and redo a piece of work or spend an inordinate amount of time on it to try and get it to a certain standard. And that can be harmful because it can build a sort of sleep deficit if they're working through the night. It can be sort of very anxiety inducing in and of itself, and they often beat themselves up if they don't meet the targets that they want to. So having honest and open discussions with your student, setting, you know, limits, saying, look, okay, don't spend more than 2 hours on this piece of work, please, let's time it, can be really, really helpful. So talk through those with your student if you can. Making sense? Okay, but the key thing here is there's not really a right and wrong answer. With your student, walk through their day, find out what are the good bits and the bad bits for them, and then have a brainstorm with them about what they think might be helpful. You'll have ideas here about what's within your power to change or suggestions you might make to them, but really what you want is to enable your student to start coming up with some of these ideas for themselves, because we need to give them the ability to manage themselves and their own recovery, to seek support as needed and to make good, positive, proactive choices. When we're looking at the long term of living with these sorts of difficulties and recovering from them, a key thing is learning to manage the kind of ups and downs of day-to-day life. So supporting a student to work through these ideas themselves rather than just telling them what to do and fixing it for them is really, really important. Okay, which comes on to don't fix. So it's not your job to fix this problem for your student. You can't make it better. You can't take away the fact that your student has an eating disorder. You can't fix that. There might be things you can do. You might be able to refer them for further support. You might be able to kind of guide them, but you can't fix them, and you'll want to, right? You're here because you want to be able to make this better for them. Eating disorders are incredibly complex mental illnesses, and getting better from them is a long-term thing. This is not something you want to be able to sit down and make better right away, and it is not within your kind of professional capacity to be able to fix this. And it's really important to recognise that, and it can be really helpful to be honest with your student about that and say, I can't make this better, but what I can do is walk with you. I can support you to try and, you know, get the right treatment or to make some changes that make the day-to-day more manageable, for example. It can be really, really powerful for a student to know that there's a trusted adult in their life who is walking non-judgmentally alongside them, who they can go to bounce ideas off, who they can go to for support. You don't have to be able to make this better by yourself to fix it in order to be having a huge impact on that student and their life. So don't feel you have to fix it. We always have this image of the St. Bernard, and we want to be the St. Bernard and bound along and fix our students. But actually what we encourage is that we should be the dolphin. So we're jumping alongside the student. We're not trying to fix them. We're walking with them. That's hard. We want to fix them. But we have to accept that, you know, this is a long-term and a team effort, and this bit probably isn't within our power. But there are lots of things we can do day to day to support them, and actually just being that person who is always there, unconditionally supporting, caring, and them knowing they can turn to us is hugely, hugely powerful. So I mentioned we can't fix this. In many instances, if you think that a student has a diagnosable mental illness, particularly an eating disorder, then we would look to escalate this. So it's really important that we do recognise that where we're seeing these difficulties in our students, that this is something that we should be referring on for additional support. So people often ask, I cover a whole range of different mental illnesses and mental health issues, and people are concerned, which are the ones that we should be referring on and which are the ones we're expected to deal with ourselves. eating disorders are something that are being taken increasingly seriously in the UK. Eating disorder services have received significant additional funding. Those of you who work for those services in the room would argue we need yet more. We really do. But eating disorders are one of the mental illnesses that should be more likely to trigger a referral. Now, if you end up in the position of supporting a student who you think does need specialist support, there are some things you can do to help guide them towards the right support and helping to ensure that they get the support that's needed. One is about having open and honest discussions with them about the fact that actually, do they want this to change? Can they imagine their life being like this in a year's time, in 5 years' time? Sometimes when we have an eating disorder, we're very resistant to change. We hold the eating disorder close. We want to protect those behaviours because on some level they make us feel good, maybe more in control. There's something about it that is meeting an unmet need. So actually helping that student to recognise that things could be better if. And sometimes about finding that little chink in the armour, the small thing, you know, perhaps the impact that this is having on their life that they don't want to. Maybe they feel tired all the time. Perhaps they've had to drop a sport that they used to really enjoy. Perhaps they find that, you know, they feel very, very anxious and they don't want to feel like that anymore. It's about finding the little bit which, you know, they might be able to agree, actually, I'd rather that wasn't happening, rather than trying to address, would you like everything to change? So finding the chink in the armour and actually getting them to a point where they feel ready to access support. The other thing we can do is to help them to trigger the referral process by helping them to understand what information they should be sharing. So here it's about the longevity. How long has this been going on for? What impact is it having on day-to-day life? What's the impact there? So the things a clinician is always looking for is longevity and impact. A really important thing to note here is that the criteria for eating disorders don't require you to be a certain low weight in order to trigger a referral, and that is a misunderstanding within the medical profession that comes from historic requirements of diagnoses. If a student has got significantly difficult thoughts, feelings and behaviours around food, they might be any weight and they might be in need of eating disorder services. They might be underweight, they might be a healthy weight, they might be overweight. You can have an eating disorder at any size. A particular group who often don't get the support that they need are people who have gone from overweight to a healthier weight but have actually lost a significant amount of weight quickly. That's something that should trigger a referral absolutely for a clinician. If a significant amount of weight has been lost, it's really important that a clinician is made aware of that, even if the student is perhaps still overweight. The rapidity of weight loss is a key trigger for a referral into services, so it's worth being aware of that. The other thing it's worth knowing is that we have to have a certain amount of resilience when we try and refer into services. Sometimes we don't get the response that we want or need when we first approach, for example, the GP. We need to be prepared to go back if we don't get the input we need the first time. It's difficult. It does require that sort of certain amount of resilience. I know there are people here from the eating disorder services in Bournemouth. If you want to say anything, then do let me know. Yeah. Is there anything we need to know about referring into?
Just as you said, that the lady, I don't know if anyone was at the talk on Monday, I think the understanding was perhaps that you don't meet a diagnosis if you're not underweight.
Yeah.
So I think we're talking about more community care.
Yeah.
So I work for the eating disorder service within the community rather than inpatient.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the difference is.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's really nice and forward thinking about Bournemouth is actually you do a lot of work in the community. And actually one of the things we know about successful eating disorders treatment is that, you know, fine, inpatient is sometimes what you need in the short term if you're in a very, very dangerous situation, but long-term recovery, you've got to learn to live at home. And actually community support is one of the best ways of achieving that. And actually there's really good evidence that even for people who are very, very unwell and underweight with anorexia, for example, can recover very well with community support rather than necessarily always needing that inpatient care. Okay, next is something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to us, but this is about helping the student to challenge some of their thinking. So one of the things that we find that comes alongside eating disorders and other mental health issues as well is that we can have these kind of cognitive distortions. So one of the key treatments for eating disorders and a whole range of mental illnesses is cognitive behavioural therapy. And that basically is about us understanding the different thought patterns that we've got going on and their impacts on our behaviour, and beginning to address some of those different thoughts. So what we find with eating disorders is that people will have a whole range of distorted thinking that comes around food, so a kind of overemphasis on the role of food, and that, you know, if I eat this, that I'm going to get fat, and if I get fat, then, you know, this is terrible, everyone's going to think of me negatively. We put a huge overemphasis on the role of food, the role of weight, the role of shape, and how others perceive us. But at the same time, that thinking doesn't just tend to be isolated around food. It can spread into a whole range of other areas as well. And this is where you can begin to help your student tackle that faulty thinking. You might not feel able to kind of go in and say stuff around their weight or food. This might feel beyond your comfort zone. But what you can do is you can pick your student up when they have these thoughts of, you know, oh, well, I didn't do as well on that assignment as I should have. That's because I'm a complete failure and I'm rubbish at everything and I'm never going to get a job. You recognise this thinking, this kind of catastrophising? Actually, it's really important that when we see that, we help to enable students to recognise, no, this isn't logical thinking. This is distorted thinking happening, and we need to address that. And often the best way to address that is trying to look for evidence. What's the evidence of this? Or sometimes thinking, what would other people say about that? So, you know, I said something stupid in front of other people. Everybody thinks I'm stupid. I should never go near anyone ever again because I'm such a complete idiot. And, you know, again, this kind of thinking that can make us sort of push ourselves away and isolate ourselves from other people. It's about trying to question that thinking. And what we want really is for the student to be able to start questioning that thinking themselves. But in the short term, where you hear that coming up, and particularly you will hear it in relation to their academic work, we need to really question it. We need to help them understand, no, the fact that you got 95% instead of 100% on this assignment, A, that doesn't make you a failure. That's objectively a really good mark, because we often find that students will beat themselves up for not meeting perfection when actually they're doing, you know, objectively pretty well. So A, it doesn't make you a failure. You've actually done objectively well. And B, actually, even if you were to have failed this assignment, this is not going to have the ramifications that you've kind of spelt out here. Does that make sense? So we are trying to bring a kind of logical voice to this. And this can be difficult because these cognitive distortions can be very, very ingrained. And your students' kind of sense of self and their self-confidence can be very, very low, but we can begin to question that. We can try to bring in logical arguments against it. We can help them to try and find evidence for their point of view, and also challenge them to find evidence for the converse point of view. And the other thing here, as I say, is sometimes trying to bring in how someone else might think about them. So if they are making very negative comments about themselves, instead saying, what would your friend say about that? Or maybe, what would a parent say about that? And sometimes when we think about things from the point of view of someone else, we can think about it differently. If that doesn't work, you can go a step further and say, what would you say to a friend who was thinking that? And that can sometimes help us to address that faulty thinking too. But the thing here is really look out for these faulty thinking patterns, these cognitive distortions. Be aware that they occur, that they will often leach into many, many different domains of your student's life, and they can have a really significant impact on their ability to do things like socialise, on their ability to engage with their academic work. You'll sometimes find that you'll get students who kind of get a complete freeze and can't start anything at all because they don't think they can do it perfectly. And again, helping them to kind of get to this understanding that good enough is good enough is really, really important. So if you want to find out more about that, the kind of cognitive distortions, there's lots of information online around cognitive behavioural therapy and cognitive distortions particularly, and I'll send through a link to an article that I wrote recently specifically about how we can address cognitive distortions within the kind of with students essentially, that you might find helpful. Okay, next. We all right? No soft fruit. Okay. Okay, number 7. So number 7 is about expectations. So when a student is struggling with an eating disorder, it's really important that we take a moment and we do this over time and be flexible to consider what are our expectations of this pupil, and also what are their expectations of themselves, and are these realistic. So you'll have kind of got the idea, as with some of what I've said earlier on, that often these are young people who strive to achieve at the highest level, and anything other than the highest level might not feel good enough for them. But actually, if they're in the throes of an eating disorder, it might not be realistic, and it might be actively harmful for them to be trying to achieve at this highest level. Sometimes we find these are young people who are trying to achieve at the highest level across several domains in their life. So they want to be top of the class, but they also want to be, you know, on the kind of county team for their chosen sport, for example. They want to be the most popular. They want to be, you know, the top of absolutely everything. And this can be very, very difficult. When someone is suffering with an eating disorder, and perhaps they might be going through treatment, we sometimes do need to take a step back and go, what should we be expecting here? What's okay? And what is helpful in terms of your recovery? This can be really hard because this young person might feel really driven, and actually they might be achieving really highly, but we need to think about whether that's coming at a cost to their health, and whether in order to keep up with these expectations on themselves, they're doing things like forfeiting sleep. So that's a really common one we find, is that young people will be studying really long hours and not sleeping enough. And when we're thinking about what we can do in order to promote our sort of physical and mental well-being, then actually getting good and enough sleep is one of the things that we all need to do better. And if you're trying to tackle something really complicated like an eating disorder, trying to do that when you're chronically sleep deprived is much, much harder. It's much less easy to make good decisions when we're tired. I mean, we all know this, right? You have a really bad night's sleep, and actually just decision making is harder. You might be quicker to kind of anger, or you might be more tearful. Everything feels harder. If you have that happening constantly, and you're trying to make, you know, perhaps positive, proactive decisions around food and weight and exercise because you're in recovery from an eating disorder, that's very, very hard. So yeah, we don't want them to be forfeiting sleep in order to continue to achieve academically. Sometimes it will mean that a student might need to drop a couple of subjects, for example. Sometimes it will mean they need extended deadlines. Sometimes we have to be the person who helps them to think about the medium and the long term, rather than always thinking about the short term. It can be hard for our students because what they're doing right now is the most important thing they've ever done, whether they are at the point of doing GCSEs or A-levels, or they're in the process of getting their degree. This will be the most important thing they've done to date, and the idea of putting that on hold, or kind of you know, lowering their expectations of what grades they might hope to achieve, can feel catastrophic to them. But again, part of our job can be helping to put that in the big picture, and helping them to realise that actually taking it a little bit longer to achieve this, or achieving this at a slightly different level than we'd originally hoped, should hopefully mean that we're in a good and healthy place in order to take the next steps. We can also help them to understand what levels it's important for them to actually be achieving in order to take the next steps they want to. So drawing on my own experience, when I was at school, my teachers helped me to realise that by dropping an A-level, it wasn't going to stop me from applying to any of the universities that I was interested in. And I did go on to drop an A-level, and I did get an Oxbridge place. So they were right. And actually, I didn't see that because I thought that I had to be doing the best and everything. But it was incredibly helpful to have that little bit more time in the timetable. So we need to think about what's realistic, and we need to help them to understand as well what it's okay to expect of themselves. It's helpful if we can be that listening ear that helps them recognise what are the things they find really hard now. Where should they exercise a little bit of self-care and be kind to themselves? So sometimes this can also be around social things, for example, as well. So if you have an eating disorder, then social situations can become really hard. Because if you think back over the last few social situations you've been involved in, try and think about how few of them didn't involve food or drink, right? There's a huge amount of kind of food and drink and eating, drinking in front of others that happens as part of our normal kind of social experience. If you have an eating disorder, that's hugely, hugely stressful. And so these can be situations which are highly anxiety inducing, can be really, really difficult. So actually sometimes it can be helpful for that student to recognise you don't have to do all the things all the time. Try and work out a way in which it's possible for you to do this. Maybe have a buddy who is with you, who understands what's going on and can support you through those, you know, those times, or maybe build in some recovery time afterwards, or maybe have a think about, you know, how much of that it's helpful for you to be doing. But essentially, you know, you want them to be looking at kind of every domain of their life, having a think about what are their expectations of themselves right now, are those realistic, and in the short term, is it helpful to revise them? Any questions? Okay. I find it hard to know sometimes whether you're taking it all in, you're like, okay, this is fine, or if you're like, no, just tuned out. Okay. This is possibly one of the most important points I'll make. So if you have tuned out, tune back in. Just give you a moment, right, back in the room. When someone is struggling with an eating disorder, what happens, and actually again this is true of self-harm too, so what happens often is that we see physical signs of recovery. We see weight restored, whether that's coming down or going up, they get to a healthy weight. We see them apparently being okay. We might see that self-harm injuries heal and everything feels a lot better. And we go, okay, it's all right now. No, this is the point. That sounded really negative, didn't it? But this is the point when your student needs your help more than ever. Okay, so when they are no longer able to use the unhealthy coping mechanisms that they perhaps have relied on for a really long time, bless you, is the time when they really need your help. Perhaps they're no longer able to use binging to help them to manage their feelings. Maybe they're no longer harming themselves. Maybe they're no longer restricting their food intake to help them feel control. You know, in some way, those disordered behaviours will have been meeting a need for that student. And now that everything looks better, they are no longer meeting that need through those behaviours. And sure, hopefully, they will have had support and input to try and replace those unhealthy coping mechanisms with healthy coping mechanisms. But it takes time. And it's really hard to find anything that works as well as the thing you've relied on for a really long time. So what we end up with is a situation where everything looks okay and everyone goes, oh, phew, it's all right, and we step away and the support falls away. And actually, I'm the most vulnerable ever. If you have someone with an eating disorder and, they look better, often they've got huge body image issues going on. I remember, when I hit healthy weight for the first time as an adult, then so many people would be so delighted because you no longer look like you're about to kind of keel over the whole time. But actually, you're living with you're living in a body that doesn't feel like your own. You feel hugely, hugely insecure, and you no longer have the control of the one thing that used to make you feel okay. So whilst the body might look better, and we might feel that we can step off and drop that support away, actually this is the time when the support is most needed. So don't drop away that support too soon. You don't necessarily have to provide lots and lots of support, but just remember, once that student is apparently okay, this is a particularly vulnerable time. Lots and lots of people will relapse at this point, and we need to be really careful to make sure that we're there, that we're listening, that they know that we still care, and that we value them. The other thing that's important here is that also, if we step away that support too soon, that can send a really strong message to this young person that the way that you access support is through these harmful behaviours. And they kind of, maybe on quite a subconscious level, but they know in future, if I need help and support from people, what I need to do is, lose weight or be binging or whatever was their harmful behaviour, because they've learnt that that was what got the input they needed in the past. And we need to break that. We need them to realise, no, actually, you can get support at any weight. You can get support when you don't have these behaviours, when you still do have those difficult thoughts and feelings. We're still going to be here. You've still got this safety net, this support network who is here to help you. Make sense? So don't step away too soon. It's difficult to know exactly how long we need that support to be in place, and of course it can taper off over time. The most helpful thing you can do is obviously keep open lines of communication with that student. Talk to them, find out what's helpful for them. You don't want to feel overbearing. You want to give them the freedom to go off and be independent, and actually long-term recovery is about them being able to do this on their own. So talk to them about what level of input is helpful, and be flexible, and always be aware of the kind of the warning signs that things are beginning to feel a little bit more difficult for them, and be prepared to step that support up more if needed. But yeah, keep talking to them. But it might be that you want to make sure that they're having some sort of check-in, even if it's not all that regularly, for many months after things appear okay. And yeah, there's no length of time that's really kind of too long, because these issues can always kind of recur. So even when you do step that support away, just think about having just a check-in, even if it's only every few months or so. There should be a trusted adult in school or university who's going to check in with that student. And the other thing there is making them aware of how they go about kind of accessing support if things do begin to feel more difficult. So it's really important that students recognise in themselves the warning signs that things are beginning to go less well, so they can then, you know, say, need more help now, please, because it's really, really important they're able to do that before things get to the point where, you know, everything's kind of got really, really difficult again. It's so much easier for us to manage minor blips and to deal with things if we kind of notice that they're about to happen, rather than at the point at which things have gone completely off the rails again. That's really key. And this can take time, and you can do things like with the student look back on historic times and say, oh, what do you think are the warning signs that we might have picked up on if we'd known now, you know, knowing now what we know now, what are the warning signs that were there, what could we look out for in future? So for me, one of the things I'm always really aware of is if I find that when I'm served food, then I just don't want to eat it, or I find fault with it, or I think it's been cooked badly, and I start finding excuses to kind of not eat that, then I know that for me is a sign that, okay, no, this is a problem. I need to make sure that I eat these meals, or I need to get some additional input, have my husband come and eat with me, for example. I know that, yeah, as soon as I start finding excuses to not eat meals, that's a really key thing. But it won't all be around food. So again, for me, another one of the warning signs that I look out for in my kind of day-to-day life that things are perhaps going less well is if I see on my phone that I've got loads and loads of unanswered text messages or emails that I haven't got back to, or calls that I haven't answered. When I begin to sort of shut myself off, again, that for me is a really major warning sign that things are beginning to go less well, and that is the point at which I have to go, right, I need a little bit of extra support and input here. I need to take extra care that, you know, food is all on track, that I'm getting enough sleep, that people are supporting me as needed. Okay, and then finally, we're doing quite well for time. Finally, we need to recognise that recovery isn't going to be a straight line. So one of the really difficult things about eating disorders is that, you know, so many of us have this perfectionist mindset, and we apply that to recovery as well. And we can have this very black and white thinking, and we think, you know, if we're not achieving up here, we're failing, and we apply that to our recovery. So we might have the smallest slip up, and actually we don't see that as a little slip up that brings us down here. We think, right, we've failed, and we're right back to square one, and everything can fall apart quite quickly because of that. Actually, Eating Disorders Awareness Week can be really difficult for those of us with eating disorders because of this very precise reason. So what happens during this week is the media is full of fantastic success stories of people who motivate and inspire us to get over our eating disorder, because they share their story and they share their perfect recovery, and we look at them and we think, I'm not doing it that well. And I find this now, you know, years and years and years in, like to Eating Disorders Awareness Week, still every year I have to take a step back from those stories, because otherwise you compare yourself to other people. And even though now you're fighting this illness and you're not comparing yourself and wanting to be thinner or iller, you're wanting to do better at being well. And there's this constant comparison, and it's very, very difficult. But actually, one of the things that we need to learn in order to be able to sustain recovery over the long term is it isn't a straight line. It's normal to have ups and downs, and actually what we need to do is learn how to recognise when those difficult times are coming, or to learn to kind of bounce back when we do have difficulties. So getting over an eating disorder is not about never binging again. It's not about never skipping a meal ever again. It's not about ever, never making yourself sick again, or whatever it might be that is the difficult behaviour that you have. But it's about recognising that if I slip, it doesn't put me back at square one. That means I had a bad day. Everyone can have a bad day, and what I need to do on that bad day is not say, right, well, I failed and I'm going to sink right back into all my old habits, but rather say, okay, it's a bad day. What do I do on a bad day? What will help me? What will sustain me in my recovery here? And actually, we can try and flip the narrative on that a little bit, and instead of seeing a bad day as a negative and a blip in our recovery, if we're able to seek the support of those around us and to try and overcome those difficult days, those are the days that we should be most proud of, actually. In order for a young person to be able to live with the kind of, potential long-term impact of eating disorder behaviour, many people feel you can fully recover from this, but you have to be really self-aware. You have to be aware that at some point in your life, these thoughts, these feelings might come back to you, and you need to know how to manage them. So actually, in the sort of short and the medium term, if that recovery doesn't go perfectly and we experience some difficulties and we learn to recognise the warning signs and and we learn what to do in order to overcome them. Actually, those are the skills that we need in order to keep ourselves well long term. So try and be encouraging if you can, if you're supporting a young person and they feel they should be recovering perfectly, because actually nobody does, and we learn so much more from how we get up rather than from never falling. Okay, I'm going to highlight a couple of resources for you. So we've mentioned Eating Disorders Awareness Week. So BEAT is the Eating Disorders charity. There's loads of great information on their website, and there's lots going on for Eating Disorders Awareness Week. The hashtag is EDAW, Eating Disorders Awareness Week 2019. It's worth checking that out on Twitter and other social media. Obviously there are other talks going on. I've got one this afternoon on autism and anorexia. I'm drawing on my personal experience, which I'm grateful to James for the opportunity to talk about. We'd love to see some of you there. A new book, which I think potentially comes out today. So Hope with Eating Disorders by Lynn Crilly. So Lynn Crilly has twin daughters, one of whom had anorexia. The daughters are grown up now. She wrote the first edition of her book a few years ago because she wanted to know how better to support her daughter with her eating disorder. And there was very little good information out there. In the meantime, since she wrote the first edition, which was very good, she's gone out and she's done a huge amount of kind of personal development, and she's trained as a counsellor, and she's spent a lot of time working with many people in the field to kind of improve her understanding, and she's just released this new edition of her book, and for me it's a really fantastic addition to the sector. It's good for anyone who is concerned about someone with an eating disorder, and it really helps to give you some insight. One of the really nice things about this book is that it has Lynn's voice as the carer, but she also includes the voice of both of her daughters, so the one who suffered and her sibling as well as the voices of other sufferers. But it's really nice getting those sort of twin perspectives. So it's worth looking out. I mean, there's lots of good literature out there, but this is a new one you might not have come across yet. And if you've read the first edition, I would recommend that the second edition, there's significant additions to it. And yeah, a plug for my own YouTube channel. So I release new videos a couple of times a week. I did one yesterday about eating disorders in adults. So we've been talking about students, but actually some of you will be working obviously with older students, and you might be interested in that about eating disorders in adults. But I release new videos a couple of times a week. They're not all about eating disorders. I just included the playlist here from the eating disorders stuff. But yeah, hopefully helpful. And I think that's it. Okay. Wow, long time. So,